There is a lot that can be said about Mr. Universe. He is a great singer, he lives that van life, and whether he had a lot of money or no money, he was a good dad. But for some reason, people don't agree with that last statement. Yes, this sweet man who was always there for Stephen, or at least tried his best to be there as often as possible, is considered by some to be a bad dad. Greg was a very supportive father. He taught his son empathy and how to treat others how they wish to be treated. He explained to him that not everything has to be perfect, with his favorite phrase,
"Hey buddy, if every pork chop were perfect, we wouldn't have hot dogs."
When I see people criticizing Greg, their main arguments are good arguments. Stephen never went to school, causing him to be socially awkward around people his own age, which we see in Steven Universe's future as he tries to get along with Connie's school friends. They also will say, well, Stephen never went to the doctors before, which is not a very good thing. Again, this is seen in Steven Universe's future, where he finally does go to the hospital. Finally, they like to say Stephen was put in too many dangerous circumstances due to living with the Jims. Why did Greg let him keep living with them? They say this looking at all the dangerous circumstances that Stephen had to live through. Now, the people that I see giving these criticisms to Greg's choices seem to put Stephen in the same category as a normal child. Now, my whole argument hinges on the fact that Stephen is not a normal child. He is half alien. He is powerful, dangerous, when emotionally unstable. For the most part, Stephen is a normal child, except for the fact that he and the Jims attract trouble, quite literally. They attract corrupted Jims, and this is stated by the Crystal Gems when talking to Ronaldo, that they are the reasons that monsters keep attacking Beach City.
Way safer if you guys weren't here!
Listen, Frybo. Magic beings are indeed drawn to us, but...
The reason I say this is mainly due to the first argument that people give that I'm going to tackle. Oh, Stephen never went to school. Which is bad for a child, but they never take into account that he was homeschooled. We see that Pearl in one of the episodes has all the stuff to teach Stephen all types of subjects. And Pearl is more than qualified to teach Stephen on her own, being far more intelligent than any human on the planet. In the episode where we see all of the stuff, she doesn't go on to continue to teach him in that episode, but we can assume that she still put that stuff to use because Pearl is not the type of person to collect items. She does not like useless things. We also see that Stephen grows up to be very intelligent to the point where he can broker peace throughout the universe. He's able to start a school for gems and manage an entire new town. We see that in Steven Universe future, he is what I would call a very educated young man. But education is not the only reason to go to school. There's also socialization, which we see that Stephen lacks. But I don't think that that is much of a detriment to him, seeing that we see him be very emotionally intelligent when it comes to others. He is also very good at socializing outside of when he's talking to people in his own age group, but that is mainly due to the fact that he does not want to be seen as weird. We also have to take into account that if Stephen went to school, he would attract corrupted gems and possibly have emotional outbursts would put children in danger that normal society would not have the facilities to take care of. We saw he had very little control over his powers. In the beginning, it was bad enough that he put himself and Connie into a bubble and he was trying to get them out, and they ended up at the bottom of the sea. Now, imagine that, but he accidentally gets his entire class stuck in one of his bubbles. Stephen was able to deactivate his bubble after his emotions calmed down, and Connie said that she was having fun, which put his worries at ease and putting his defenses down. Now ask yourself, how easy would that have been if there was a bunch of middle school to elementary schoolers screaming, yelling, and panicking the entire time? He wouldn't have been able to control his powers and eventually let it down. They would be stuck in there until the gems got him out, putting his entire class not only in danger but also disrupting the class and causing them to miss an entire day of lessons, putting them behind. Something that these kinds of shows that have stuff happen to the protagonists in classes and classes get interrupted never really take into account that there are lesson plans that get thrown out the window because of the whims of the antagonist, and the entire lessons that can't be completed because the protagonist keeps interrupting the class, so Stephen would most likely have been a hindrance, a danger, and possibly just expelled from school. Plus, as a side note, once Greg did get money, he showed that he did value higher education, saying that he would put Stephen through college. The next big button that these criticizers like to press is, well, he never took him to the doctors. Let's all remember that Greg did not have a lot of money, which means probably he wouldn't be able to just take Stephen to the hospital unless it was an emergency. Now, when I was growing up, the only time I went to the hospital was because something was wrong. I got hurt, something in my body changed, or I was in pain of some kind, or severely sick. All of these visits were extremely expensive. Greg lived out of his van and ran a car wash business in a town that barely had anyone in it for the majority of the year until the summer rush. And once Greg did have the money, Stephen had already found out about his healing powers, meaning that there was no reason for him to go to the hospital because he could instantly heal himself. Stephen, at most, only had a black eye, and that was after being punched by Jasper, and in my opinion, that should have been healed up very fast. But it was left on there for the audience to know that trauma had happened. Saying all this does not mean that Greg was fully in the right in this regard, because he also didn't have routine checkups for Stephen. In fact, he didn't even realize that Stephen had stopped growing for a couple years, as seen in Stephen's birthday episode. Now, this could also just be put under the umbrella of not having enough money for a pediatrician. When it comes to taking Stephen to the hospital, you really have to ask yourself, why take a healthy child to the hospital? Now, this next topic, in my opinion, is the most damning when it comes to Greg being a bad father. The fact that he allows Stephen to live alone with the Jims. I'm saying that this is the most damning because the reasons he does not live with Stephen are ultimately selfish, but understandable in my opinion. Greg does not feel welcome in the house that Stephen lives in. Greg has past trauma with 2 out of the 3 Jims. Pearl outright disrespects, disregards, and all but hates Greg due to her jealousy with the whole Rose Quartz relationship. Part of Pearl blames Greg for Stephen existing in the first place. If it wasn't for Greg, Rose Quartz wouldn't have given herself up to let Stephen be. Greg is avoiding interactions with Pearl because he feels guilty and unwanted around her. Greg also has a bit of a past with Amethyst, not romantic or anything, but traumatic all the same. After Rose Quartz was gone, Greg and Amethyst would watch a TV show together, and in this they had a friendship which would eventually become unhealthy because Amethyst would use her shape-shifting ability to look like Rose. This, of course, made Greg wildly uncomfortable after a while, and they stopped hanging out, and ever since then, Greg did not hang out one-on-one with Amethyst. In fact, we see in the show what happens when they do start hanging out one-on-one again. Amethyst does the same thing, trying to get Greg to hang out with her, turning herself into Rose, and talking to him like Rose. With 2 out of 4 of the residents of that house being people that are emotionally triggering for Greg, he opted out of living in the same house as the people he could not get along with in front of his son. Though he did come around as often as he could, as seen in the show where he would sing to Stephen when they would hang out in front of the house on the beach. It is implied, if not shown, that Greg spends winters in the house with Stephen due to the heat in his van not working. All that into consideration, it does not excuse his willing absence in the home. Stephen, of course, was put in many dangers when living with the Jims, and went wildly misunderstood by his 3 caregivers in the home. So some audio got corrupted, but what I said during it was Greg provides still everything that Stephen needs. He built the house for him. It is obvious that he pays for the food, the electricity, the water, and the taxes on the house. So he's still doing the job of a father by providing everything that Stephen needs. He didn't want Stephen to live in a van with him because he understood that he needed Stephen to live in a house so that he would have stability. And also, the van life is not luxurious in any way, especially the way that Greg was doing it. Unless you are of the mind that everything that Steven owns and eats was all stolen by Amethyst, which wouldn't put it past her. But it's probably not true. It is a parent's job to give their child the life that they would have wanted while they were growing up, which is why Greg gave Steven the freedom that he craved when he was young. Greg grew up in a hostile and controlling home to the point where they wouldn't let him listen to the type of music that they didn't approve of. Living in that kind of extreme caused Greg to want to give Steven the other side of that coin. Steven grew up with an extreme amount of freedom when it came to his choices. Greg allowed Steven to make grown-up decisions before he was a grown-up. This is not the best situation to grow up in. A lack of structure allowed Steven to put himself in dangerous situations that he was not prepared for and make decisions that would scar him for the rest of his life. One of these decisions was to go on adventures with the gems, putting himself in mortal peril over and over. Though he had the protection of 3 gems, many of the missions were too dangerous even for them. Although Steven going on these missions ultimately saved the world from the cluster and stopped the universe-wide dictatorship, it is still bad parenting to allow your child to gallivant around the world and space. Though it could be argued that that would have been done without Greg's permission in the first place. The gems do have a history of kidnapping Steven. And also, many of these missions went on without Greg's knowledge. He was in fact appalled to hear that Steven was in any kind of danger and was worried. In fact, when we see the introduction of Jasper coming to Earth, Greg initially got Steven and was driving away from Beach City, getting his son out of harm's way. He did this because the gems allowed him to. Now, ultimately, Steven told Greg to let him go back, and Greg did, which is not the best decision, but he showed trust in Steven because Steven, up to this point, had done things to earn Greg's trust in these crisis situations. In conclusion, while Greg was not the best dad in the world, he made every effort he could to give Steven the life that he would have wanted growing up. He had a child that he could not understand, but Greg provided for him in every way he could, giving him a home, placing him in the care of 3 beings that could somewhat understand Steven's abilities, and gave Steven every opportunity to succeed in anything he wanted to, and was always supportive till the very end. And that is why Greg Universe is a good dad. Oh, you're still here? You got all the way to the end? Well, I hope that you liked it. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've made it to this point, here's a video of Ronaldo getting hit with a barrel.
You snonster! Ah!